They were paraded barefoot through the streets, their heads forcibly shaved, swastikas scrawled across their foreheads. Some were stripped, spat on, beaten. One woman even had her breasts slashed in public. These weren't Nazi officials or war criminals. They were women, often young, accused of sleeping with the enemy. As World War II ended and Allied forces liberated Europe, a new kind of violence erupted. In a frenzy of vengeance, communities turned on their own. The most visible targets? Women suspected of horizontal collaboration with German soldiers. In France alone, an estimated 20,000 women were publicly humiliated, tortured, or even killed. Not by courts, but by neighbors, vigilantes, and mobs. This isn't a story about justice. It's a story about shame, revenge, and the brutal spectacle of punishment. This video uncovers the unsettling truth of how liberation gave rise to one of history's least discussed gendered purges. To understand the brutal retribution against these women, we must first examine the atmosphere of occupied Europe. From 1940 to 1945, Nazi forces controlled vast swaths of the continent, including France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Eastern Europe. Collaboration took many forms: economic, political, and personal. For women, it often meant survival through proximity to power, sometimes as informants, lovers, or even forced companions of German soldiers. This phenomenon became known as horizontal collaboration, and while some women did so willingly, many were coerced by desperation, hunger, or threats to their families. Gendered expectations painted women as the moral guardians of society, so their alleged betrayals provoked intense social outrage, far more than male collaborators often faced. When liberation came, the rage that had simmered under Nazi occupation erupted. Lacking formal justice mechanisms, communities resorted to symbolic punishment. Shaving a woman's head, an act of sexual and social emasculation, was both a warning and a spectacle. In many cases, this was not just spontaneous rage, but part of orchestrated rituals, often involving local resistance fighters eager to assert authority. The war may have ended, but in the streets of Europe, a new battle began. One for honor, purity, and control of women's bodies. Not all women accused of collaboration were innocent or passive. Some actively aided the Nazi regime as informants, prison guards, and enforcers of brutal policies. Their roles, though fewer in number than their male counterparts, were no less vicious. Hermine Braunsteiner, later dubbed the Stomping Mare, served as a guard at Majdanek concentration camp. She kicked inmates to death, beat children, and oversaw selections for the gas chambers. After the war, she fled to the U.S., only to be extradited decades later. Annalisa Coleman, another notorious female guard, worked at Hamburg subcamps, where she whipped and sexually humiliated prisoners. Captured after the war, her trial shocked the public due to the depravity of her crimes. Then there were collaborators like Stella Goldschlag, a Jewish woman in Berlin tortured by the Gestapo. To survive, she became a greifer, a catcher, hunting fellow Jews in hiding. Her betrayal sent dozens, possibly hundreds, to their deaths. Her story remains one of the most tragic and morally complex of the war. And in France, Violette Morris, an athlete turned Nazi agent, was linked to interrogations and executions. Although her role is still debated, she was eventually ambushed and killed by the resistance. These women weren't simply victims of circumstance. They were willing instruments of a genocidal regime. Yet after the war, even those with far lesser roles faced retribution, and the line between collaboration and mere association was often drawn in blood and spectacle. When Nazi control collapsed, the thirst for revenge exploded across liberated Europe. But formal justice was slow, and people wanted immediate reckoning. The result? A surge of vigilante punishments, especially targeting women accused of horizontal collaboration. Nowhere was this more visible than in France. Thousands of women were forcibly shaved, an act symbolizing disgrace, stripping them of femininity and marking them as traitors. But it didn't stop there. In towns like Chartres, mobs stripped women naked, smeared them with tar or excrement, paraded them through jeering crowds, and sometimes beat them to unconsciousness. Children were made to watch. Cameras captured it all. In Belgium, one woman was kicked and stoned before being tied to a lamppost with a sign reading, "I slept with a Bosch." In the Netherlands, some were whipped or branded with red-hot irons. Others were raped or had their babies taken away. The public torture of these women wasn't just punishment, it was theater, a grotesque ritual of purification where communities cleansed their guilt by destroying a scapegoat. Men who had profited under Nazi rule went free, but a kiss, a child by a German soldier, or even unfounded rumors could condemn a woman to lifelong shame. In these frenzied days of liberation, justice often wore the face of a mob, and the bodies punished were disproportionately female. The brutality inflicted on these women reveals more than just post-war vengeance. It exposes deep-rooted gender politics and collective denial. Why were women punished more visibly and violently than many male collaborators? Because their alleged betrayal was not just political, it was sexual, maternal, and symbolic. Under Nazi occupation, women's bodies became contested ground. Relationships with German soldiers, whether consensual or coerced, were framed as betrayals of the nation itself. Society viewed a woman's sexuality as tied to national honor, so sleeping with the enemy was seen as violating the body politic. But many of these women had no real agency. Some were raped or entered relationships for survival. Others were young, manipulated, or naive. Still, post-liberation mobs didn't care. They judged not motives, but appearances. Meanwhile, men who collaborated through politics, business, or military service often escaped such public disgrace. The message was clear. A man's betrayal could be rationalized. A woman's body must be punished. This gendered spectacle of punishment, shaving, stripping, parading, was not just about justice. It was about control, humiliation, and restoring a sense of moral order through the symbolic domination of women. These acts weren't just vengeance. They were a violent reassertion of patriarchy under the guise of liberation. To fully grasp the personal horror behind these mass humiliations, we turn to three deeply revealing case studies, each a blend of betrayal, survival, and societal scapegoating. Stella Goldschlag was a blonde-haired Jewish woman living in Berlin. After being tortured by the Gestapo, she became a notorious grifer, identifying Jews and hiding in exchange for her life. Stella's actions led to the arrest and deportation of countless people, including some of her own acquaintances. Yet her story defies simple judgment. She acted under brutal coercion. After the war, Stella was arrested by Soviet authorities, later released, and lived the rest of her life isolated and scorned, ultimately dying by suicide in 1994. Her life forces us to ask, can collaboration under torture ever be called a choice? In Chartres, France, August 1944, photojournalist Robert Capa captured a haunting image. A woman named Simone Tussaud, barefoot, holding her infant, her head freshly shorn, surrounded by a sneering crowd. Her crime? Having a relationship with a German soldier. Her child, branded a child of shame, would carry that stigma for decades. The photo became iconic, a symbol of post-liberation cruelty. Simone was never charged in court, but the public spectacle was punishment enough. Violette Morris, a French athlete turned collaborator, allegedly aided the Gestapo in tortures and interrogations. Though some claims remain unverified, her masculinity and open lesbian identity made her a target. In 1944, the resistance ambushed her car and executed her without trial. Each of these women's stories offers a window into a world where survival, coercion, and rebellion blurred into betrayal. Their fates weren't always about guilt, but about who was allowed to survive with dignity and who would pay society's emotional debt for wartime humiliation. In the post-war years, the women publicly shamed for collaboration, real or suspected, were largely abandoned by both justice and memory. Few were formally prosecuted. Most were punished extrajudicially, with their shorn heads and public humiliation standing in for legal accountability. Some, like Stella Goldschlag, lived haunted lives of isolation. Others, like Simone Tussaud, faded quietly into obscurity, forever marked by a moment captured on film. Historians and feminists have since reframed these events as expressions of gendered violence masquerading as justice. The women, often powerless during occupation, became scapegoats for a nation's trauma and complicity. Meanwhile, many male collaborators reintegrated into society with little scrutiny. These acts of vengeance have left a long shadow, not just in the lives of those punished, but in how nations remember the war. Liberation is often told as a story of glory, but within it lie episodes of cruelty that demand reckoning, not romanticism. In the post-war reckoning, justice came unevenly. Many women, accused of collaborating with Nazis, were never tried in court, but were instead punished in the streets. Through public shaming, violence, and social exile, their names vanished from official records, their stories buried beneath national myths of resistance and heroism. Even the children they bore, so-called children of shame, often grew up ostracized. Today, scholars reevaluate these acts not as justice, but as symbolic violence, targeted more at reasserting gender and moral control than holding actual collaborators accountable. These women, often powerless under occupation, became vessels for society's guilt, rage, and desire to move on. Meanwhile, many men who had aided the occupiers economically or politically were quietly forgiven or forgotten. Liberation, for all its triumph, was also a moment of reckoning with what survival had required. If justice is blind, why did it look so much like a mirror reflecting only women?